Hello whisky fans and welcome back. Last time we had a look at the no age statement 40% eponymous black bottle. Wasn't a huge fan of that. I think that it may have been great in years gone by, it's not so great now. Probably not worth the purchase, but these two look to be a lot more promising, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Black Bottle Double Cask Alchemy Series Experiment Number 1. So I do like whiskey experiments. I like when people try things new and offer something different, and I really like when people offer craft presented whiskey, and this is at least halfway there because it's 46.3% ABV, and also if you look on the back label, it is non-chill filtered. As for colouring, almost certainly is coloured. It doesn't say either way. It's also a blended Scotch whisky, so there is grain whisky gone into this. It's not a blended malt, it's definitely not a single malt, but because this is a distill product, we can probably assume that there's going to be a lot of either Deanston, Tobermory or Bunnahabhain in this one, and Bunnahabhain for at least the last sort of 10 plus years has had a strong association with Black Bottle, and I personally think that a lot of the malt content in this is probably Bunnahabhain. So as for the name of this one, Black Bottle Double Cask, I do think that is an incredibly low effort name for a whiskey. It's incredibly unoriginal. There's a long list of whiskey distilleries that have used the term double cask to name a whiskey now, including Tamnavulin, Macallan have had a double cask, Glen Scotia, I believe what is still their bottom rung entry in their range is still the Glen Scotia double cask, unless it's been discontinued recently. So yeah, could have come up with something a little bit more interesting than that, especially when you consider that this one, in their own words, it's two exquisite liquids become one, as malts finished in Spanish sherry barrels meet 12-year-old grain matured in red wine casks. So that's not your typical boring blended whiskey. They've put some thought into this, and they've put some money into some casks and the actual treatment of the casks that go into this. So could have perhaps done a little bit better than double cask. Saying that, it may be an absolutely cracking whiskey, but what do we know from the casks that are telling us that are used in this one? Now, obviously, it's a blended Scotch whisky, so there is malt and grain, and they've told us that that malt whisky is finished, not matured, in Spanish sherry barrels. So you can probably assume that the majority of the malt content in this is probably matured in either bourbon barrels or possibly hogsheads. It's going to be an economical production, and then it's finished in Spanish sherry barrels. Now, I think that's a very clever way to word that. Spanish sherry barrels sounds like genuine European oak sherry butts, but I'm guessing, and I don't know, but I'm guessing it's probably not the case, because genuine European oak Spanish sherry butts are very expensive, and they're becoming rarer and rarer as time goes on. And also the fact that they call it a barrel is not just a wooden container. A barrel is a specific size and shape wooden container, most commonly used for the maturation of bourbon whiskey over in the US. So if this is finished in Spanish sherry barrels, you can probably assume that those are probably ASB casks, American Standard barrels, i.e. bourbon barrels, that have then been treated with sherry. As for the grain whiskey, it says that it's matured, so hopefully full term matured, in red wine casks. Why did they choose to have the grain whiskey go into red wine casks rather than using those red wine casks on the malt content? No idea, but it's interesting that they've done that. It's really good that they've chosen to tell us all of these details, and I think it's really good that they're obviously putting a lot of thought into how they make this whiskey. Another little thing reading between the lines, they don't put an age statement on this, but they do tell us that the grain whiskey is 12 years old. They don't give us an age statement of any type for the malt whiskey. So very interesting there in terms of what they're not saying rather than what they are saying. If the grain whiskey is 12 years old, but they're not going to put an age statement on it, leads you to think that the malt content in this must be significantly younger than 12 years old. Otherwise, they'd just put the extra few years on it and slap an age statement on it. The fact that they're not willing to do this which is fair enough at a product for this price point, but it leads you to think that that malt is probably significantly younger than 12. Apart from that, I do really like the bottles that this comes in. I like the old retro label, just let you have a look there. Very old school. I don't like that it has this Spirits Business Master 2021 sticker on it. I think that awards and medals and stuff on bottles of whiskies and labels are incredibly patronising, and they almost always mean nothing at all. But bottle shape on this one's really nice as well. Fits in your hand really nicely. Proper old school wide, kind of retro Highland Park style bottle. The only thing I don't like about these wide bottles is that it does always seem like the whiskey goes down rather quickly in these wide bottles. Kind of goes down in chunks. I don't know why that is, but it's something that I always find. Makes no sense, but there you go. Also really like that it's in dark glass, because in theory that means that there's no need to colour this whiskey, because the customer can't see the colour of it before they buy it, and it also gives it a little bit of protection from the sun. So that's enough of that. Let's get the horrible cheap screw cap off, which again, fair enough on a whiskey that only costs £25 a bottle, full price. Let's get some in the glass. See if Black Bottle Double Cask Alchemy Series Experiment number 1 is any good. So the nose on this one, you can instantly tell that it is a little bit young. But you've got to keep in mind that this is a very low price point whiskey. It's very accessible, and they've offered it at a really good ABV. So you can't really expect everything. I think that the nose, it's perhaps a little hot at first, a little bit harsh, but it's also a very flavourful and very enjoyable nose. It's very fruity, intoxicatingly sweet and rubbery grape notes on the nose of this one. Getting some nice, slightly spicy, nutty Christmas cake notes. Getting some lovely fruity strawberry notes in there, perhaps strawberry flavoured sweets, confectionery, and a little bit of a cream sherry note to this one. And I don't mean that cream sherry, for anyone that doesn't know, it's the cheap, incredibly sweet kind of cheap supermarket sherry. It's just that there's an aroma to this one that reminds me of cream sherry. It's also a lovely, luxurious, intoxicatingly sweet, dark fruit note to this one. Kind of like strawberries dipped, like fresh strawberries dipped in milk chocolate, if you've ever had that. It's also a faint pepperiness to the nose on this one, and a slightly disappointing, slight cardboardy graininess. Let's see how it tastes. Hard to make any sort of comment on the colour of this one. For what it's worth, I haven't added any water to this, so it's not that meaningful. But the clarity that you're seeing there, that is supposedly non-chill filtered. So that's a nice little reference. That is what a non-chill filtered blended whiskey looks like. Bearing in mind that grain whiskey always has less oiliness to it anyway. So it will be clearer than other non-chill filtered whiskies, but that's what you've got. As for the colour, it doesn't say that it's natural colour, as I said, but you've also got to consider that the malt into this one has been matured in probably Spanish sherry seasoned casks, and they've used those red wine casks on the grain content of this, so there's going to be a lot of colour in there coming from the cask. That doesn't look, I mean it is orangey, it does look a little bit fake tanned, but there's going to be a lot of colour coming from the casks anyway. As for the flavours coming through on the palate, getting lots of chocolate and dark fruit notes coming through, so similar to what we had on the nose. And those dark fruit notes, it's the kind of thing that often comes through from a red wine treatment. Now, red wine casks aren't for everyone. I myself don't particularly love red wine cask finished whiskey. I think that it can work. I mean, there was a Lefroy Cartchis release a couple of years ago that was partly matured or finished, I can't remember, in red wine barriques. And that was really good. It worked really, really well as one component of the whisky. And I'm going to say that this is a similar level of success because it's not completely matured in those red wine casks. And this may be why they chose to mature the grain in red wine casks when the malt was matured in those sherry casks or finished in those sherry casks. Because the red wine is only one component of this, I think that it's probably a better whisky than if the whole thing had been dumped into a red wine cask. Also getting some lovely savoury notes, which again I think is probably coming through from that red wine. There's a nice bit of maltiness to this. You can definitely tell that there's a decent quantity of malt whisky gone into this, but really that sherry and red wine really dominate on this one. On the palate, I think that this one is simple but very pleasant. I think that there are definitely signs of youth on this one. It is a young whisky, there's no getting away from that. And there are some disappointing coconut grain notes, especially late on the palate, but overall, pretty successful. Let's have one more sip and look at the finish. That fruitiness is really nice on this one. You're not going to hear me say this too often because I generally don't like and tend not to buy whisky that's been near a red wine cask because it can be very heavy-handed. It has a habit of covering up the base spirit in ways that I don't particularly enjoy. But the fruitiness that you're getting from the red wine on this one, I think it works really well. As for the finish, it's a pretty short finish with lots of sweet red grape and some chocolatiness. All in all, I think that the Bunnahabhain on this one is instantly apparent, even though you can tell that it's a blended whisky and you can tell that it's young. You can really tell that there's been some Bunnahabhain go into this one. And Bunnahabhain is always a good thing. It's a fantastic distillery that I've kind of been in love with ever since they did the 46.3% rebrand. And this comes across to me like a economical and young but very well made wine finished Bunnahabhain. There is also lots of sherry influence in this one, but it's sherry without those kind of more challenging tobacco or spicy European oak notes, which to me really hints at those sherry barrels, as I said before, are probably sherry seasoned American bourbon barrels. I think that this blended Scotch really hides the fact that it is a blend very well. But saying that, I think that it's definitely more of a tasting whisky than a nosing whisky, especially when you consider that, if you go back to my tasting notes, most of the hotness and harshness and youth were really notes that I picked out in the nosing rather than the tasting. But the fact that this has been made in such a way that makes it more pleasant to taste rather than to nose is probably not an accident when you consider the price point of this and probably the intended market for this whisky. So let's ask the ridiculous, obvious question. Is it as good as Bunnahabhain 12-year-old? No. Is it better than Bunnahabhain Styradar? Again, probably not. But when you consider if you had Bunnahabhain Styradar at full price and you had this stuff at full price at £25, it's probably better value than the Styradar and it's nearly as good. As for a grade, I'm going to give this one a C+, because I think that it's a really nice and affordable little whisky. Thanks for watching. Next time we're going to take a look at the Black Bottle Island Smoke. See you then. Thanks for watching. Cheers.